Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, and today we're very happy to present David McNally speaking on his new book, Slavery and Capitalism, a new Marxist history. David is no doubt familiar to many of you here in this meeting, but I will just say a few words about him, and then we can get started. David is the author of many works of Marxist analysis and history, including Blood and Money, Global Slump, Monsters of the Market, and now Slavery and Capitalism. David is the Distinguished Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston and Director of the Center for the Study of Capitalism. He taught political economy at York University in Toronto for many years and is the editor-in-chief of Spectre, a biannual and online journal of Marxist theory, strategy, and analysis. So David is going to talk for as long as he'd like, basically, about this great new book. And once he's done, we will open up for questions and comments. At that point, we'll ask you to keep your comments to about 3 minutes in order to give everyone a chance to speak and for David to respond. And I've also put in the chat a new reading group that begins on Monday evening, about an 8-week session, an 8-session reading group on slavery and capitalism that will be beginning here at the Marxist Education Project. So, David, take it away.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thanks to everyone who showed up to hear what I have to say about this book. I'm always so happy to participate in any events sponsored by the Marxist Education Project, and a big shout out to Fred and the whole team at the MEP, because this kind of educational work is really vital and indispensable. So thank you very much. I think the MEP does an outstanding job with its courses and guest sessions like I'm getting to share with you today. So let me say a few preliminary things about the context of Slavery and Capitalism, a new Marxist history. And then I will try to take you through some of the key lines of argument. And I hope that will allow us to have a fairly rich discussion. But of course, like every writer, I'm writing in a specific sort of context. And so I want to say just a few words initially about some of the concerns, debates, and discussions out of which this book has grown for me. I open the book with the sentence, "Whoever writes about slavery writes about freedom." And that starting point, I hope, operates as a thread throughout the book. And I do that deliberately because I believe that this moment, after decades of defeats for working class and social movements under neoliberalism, that this moment is one in which we have to reaffirm the project of human emancipation, the freedom dream. And because I see the struggles of enslaved people in the so-called New World, in the Atlantic world, as foundational to the freedom dreams we carry today, I want to start there. Because if anything has characterized neoliberalism, it's a huge deflation of hopes and expectations, and often, therefore, of social and political horizons, a shrinkage of our sense of the possible. And one of the outstanding things about immersing yourself in the struggles of enslaved peoples throughout history, particularly throughout modern capitalist history, is to see the courage, the dedication, the resourcefulness in that fight for freedom. So I give you that by way of a sort of social and political context. Of course, there are also a variety of intellectual contexts. Perhaps first and foremost, as somebody who's teaching history in the United States, is the new history of capitalism, as it's come to be called. And it's really a project among historians in the United States. It's about 15 years old. And it comes directly out of the global economic and financial crisis of 2008-9, when a layer of historians acknowledged that they did not even have the basic analytical tools for making sense of what was happening as stock markets melted down, as 5 Wall Street banks collapsed, as the global financial system literally was in the early stages of a meltdown, which was averted only because of the intervention of central banks, starting with the Federal Reserve in the United States. In that context of a global financial crisis, a layer of historians in the United States acknowledged that they didn't even have the foundational tools for addressing this. The turn to the so-called cultural turn within history had been so pronounced that they'd forgotten political economy. They'd forgotten the questions of labor, production, distribution, and so on. Of course, there were honorable exceptions to this, very honorable exceptions. But within the profession, there was a kind of taking stock moment in which there was a so-called turn to political economy and the development of new histories of capitalism. And obviously, there's much that's salutary, there's much to be celebrated about historians returning to the problem of capitalism. But my own view, which I try to develop in the book, is that there were several problems that this new history of capitalism confronted. The first was the anti-theoretical bent that dominates among historians. One participant in the decade plus of the new history of capitalism recently acknowledged that although we're doing the new history of capitalism, we are all reticent to actually define capitalism, which, needless to say, creates a few problems if you're trying to do the history of a social system that you're reluctant to define. But that comes from a kind of allergy to doing theoretical analysis. And as a result, a lot of the response was overly empirical in the new history of capitalism. Because the global crisis of 2008-9 had begun in financial markets with real estate and mortgage-based investments, in particular, collateralized debt obligations, all those esoteric terms, but basically all these financial instruments imploding. There's been a tendency in the new history of capitalism to focus overwhelmingly on finance and not on the production and distribution of goods. So that enslaved people, for instance, are quite often treated primarily as assets against which planters could borrow. In other words, as collateral, as credit collateral. And that, to me, creates huge problems because they've dropped out the key point, which I'll come back to, that enslaved people in the New World were producers of global commodities, and they made their owners immensely wealthy through the circuits of commodity production and distribution on world markets. So I'm pushing against the new history of capitalism's tendency to overly financialize our models and our theories of capitalism. But of course, I also have to come to terms with, and I believed had to develop some criticism of, some of the existing literature that claimed fidelity with Marxism with respect to slavery and capitalism. And here I have two main positions that I take issue with. The first is the historical work of the late Eugene Genovese, who was for decades considered the Marxist historian of Southern slavery in the United States. And according to Genovese, the U.S. South, prior to the Civil War, was essentially a pre-capitalist and aristocratic society. It was the closest thing to feudalism that we could see in the New World. Well, if that's right, then obviously we're not dealing with a component part of world capitalism. I think it's deeply wrong, and I'll say a little bit about that. The other interpretation by writers claiming fidelity to Marxism and historical materialism is a series of positions that argue that however much the production of commodities by enslaved people was part of or connected to in some way with capitalism, it couldn't be capitalist because bonded people, enslaved people, were constant capital. And constant capital, and I'm going to come back to this point, according to Marx, and as I'll explain later, Marx is talking about instruments of production. Constant capital, according to Marx, cannot produce surplus value. And I'll come back to this point as well. I disagree strongly with that reading as well. And what I tried to do, the book has 3 parts. The first part really tries to lay out a detailed picture of how the plantation complex worked and functioned and why it was driven by capitalist imperatives. The second part of the book then really tries to dive into the theory necessary to make sense of how we could have capitalism with unfree labor. And then in the third part of the book, I look at the struggles of enslaved people and show all of the ways in which I believe that these are working class or proletarian forms of struggle and organization that we observe. If I'm successful, I'll share a few slides with you along the way. If I botch it, it won't be tragic for our purposes, but I'm going to try to do a little bit of screen sharing in a couple of minutes. So let me start with that starting point, the picture of what the plantation complex looked like. And let me give you a few historical markers. What we call the integrated plantation, and again, I'm going to define this for you in a moment, but what we call the integrated plantation emerged in Barbados in the 1640s as an agro-industrial complex devoted to the cultivation and refining of sugar. It emerges there in the 1640s, and it becomes generalized across most of the West Indies and the US South in the period after about 1750. By the middle of the 18th century, around 1750, we can say that there is a kind of dominant plantation form, most strictly associated with sugar production in the West Indies or the Caribbean. And once the cotton boom begins in the US South, also increasingly with the cotton boom. And it finds its classic form in the period after about 1775 that a variety of historians have referred to as the second slavery. And again, I'll try to say a few words about this question of the second slavery, but that's just to give you some historical framing. The plantation complex as we know it, beginning in Barbados in the 1640s, and then that model becoming largely generalized. Not entirely, but largely generalized after 1750. So what were its features? Because this is essential to asking the question and answering it, I think, as to its capitalist nature or not. To begin with, it was a system based on general commodity production. Enslaved labor was not used primarily to produce wealth for the consumption of the master class, the planters, the slave owners. This was not like classic feudalism, where the food produced by serfs found its way to the lord's table. This is not how it worked. This was production of commodities for markets. What the lords got, the masters, the planters, what they got was money from the sale of commodities. So these were not goods for direct consumption or use values. These were exchange values being produced for global markets. I've mentioned some of them: sugar, cotton, but also tobacco, rice, coffee, indigo. These would be some of the other key global commodities that were being produced by enslaved or bonded labor. Secondly, they were being produced on what historians have called the integrated plantation. And a number of historians have described the integrated plantation as factories in the field. And it's a very apt image or an apt metaphor, because what it grasps is that these were agricultural enterprises on the one hand. They were classic cultivation of crops, planting and growing and harvesting of crops on agricultural land. But they were also both industrial in form, the use of gang labor, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but secondly, deeply integrated into a whole series of industrial processes involving more and more heavy machinery. So the sugar, for example, has to be rapidly and in very time-calibrated sequence put through a variety of processes of cleaning, boiling, solidifying, and so on, all involving industrial labor in mills and boiling and curing houses. That's why the term factories in the field or the integrated plantation. And central to this, as I just suggested, is that the integrated plantation was based on gang labor. There were large groups of people. Usually the large plantations had 3, occasionally even 4 gangs. They were assigned different parts of the work process based on age, size, ability, strength, and so on. And they worked in teams, all subjected to the same time discipline. And I'm going to give you a passage on this in a moment. But before that, I want to remind you of Marx's claim in Capital Volume 1 that capitalist production only begins when capital, quote, employs a large number of workers on an extensive scale and yields relatively large quantities of products. And this is Marx's chapter on cooperation in Volume 1 of Capital, where he makes the point that capitalism, despite the privatization of its imperatives, the appropriation of surplus value, is actually the most cooperative form of class society. Workers work in larger complexes where they need to coordinate their activities in larger groups and on larger scales than in any other form of class society. And so Marx then continues that cooperative labor constitutes a new productive power, which is an intrinsically collective one. However, that under capitalism, this new collective power is subjected to purely despotic supervision and management. So we've got that contradiction of cooperative labor and despotic control of it. Okay, let me see now if I can share a passage with you. You'll have to see. Okay, and now we'll go back to my PowerPoint, and somebody give me a shout out and tell me if you can see.
We can see.
Okay, excellent. I will actually go to slideshow if I can so that I can just give you the single screen. This is from William Dixon's Letters on Slavery from 1789, based on time he spent in Barbados. And he tries to describe the labor process. And this is why, as you'll see, I refer to gang work in Marxist terms as a real subsumption of labor to capital. Quote, "The holes are dug with hoes by the slaves in a row, with the driver at one end to preserve the line. They begin and finish a row of these holes as nearly as at the same instant as possible, so that this equal task must be performed in the same time by a number of people who, it is next to impossible, should all be equally strong and dexterous." In other words, we're dealing with people here who are, as noted, concretely differentiated. They're of unequal size, strength, mobility, dexterousness, and so on. But the gang labor regime requires that they do all of this in the same time. This is classic capitalist time discipline, and it's a manifestation of what Marx says when he talks about abstract human labor, the standardization and quantification of labor processes. Despite the concrete differences among people, they will conform to the same abstracted and standardized expectations. And by the way, we have a couple of outstanding studies recently which show us that the use of clocks, watches, and other timepieces was more advanced in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in the US South than in the North. That this was a society immersed in clock time, the very time mechanisms, of course, that dominate capitalist production and its reliance on abstract time. Gang labor was also completely immersed in a detailed division of labor. I try further to show, related to this, that there was a constant cycle of what planters refer to as improvements, what we would now call today development of the forces of production. And there's a continual experimentation with, particularly in the early going, biological transformations, development of new seed strains, and so on, by crossbreeding of seeds. So you get more and more pickable cotton, for example. The human hand can literally pick more of it because of the way that the seed strains have been developed. But this goes all the way up to basic implements like hoes, which are continually refined, but also to machinery, to the point that Louisiana sugar production, for instance, in the South in the 1850s, was arguably the most mechanized sector of production in terms of steam power anywhere in the United States. Because by the 1840s and 50s, the use of steam power on cotton plantations with the mills and in sugar was widespread. And finally, as a wonderful book recently demonstrated, from very early on, planters were using the most modern forms of accounting. So we've got all of these basic features that seem to conform to capitalism. We've got gang labor, mobilizing the forces of production under despotic control, generalized commodity production, factories in the field, the agro-industrial complexes that make up the integrated plantation. And we've got the use of detailed divisions of labor joined to classic time discipline. So that's to look at it from the side of the plantation as a basic economic unit. And I think that's indispensable. But the other side for me is also the question of classes as social formations. Because while we want to track the economic dynamics of the plantation system, it's also critical to be able to look at class formation and class struggle. And I want to start with class formation. And here, some of you will recognize the debt that I have to the preface to E.P. Thompson's great work, The Making of the English Working Class, where Thompson says, against abstract sociology, class is not a thing. Class is a dynamic relationship that happens and can be shown to happen in the contestation between social groups. So class is dynamic, it's a process, and classes make themselves through the course of their struggle. All right, with that in mind, I'm going to try to see if I can get back to sharing. And I'm going to now move up to C.L.R. James. This is C.L.R. James, the author of The Black Jacobins, still one of the outstanding classics in both history from below as well as Caribbean and working class history. And he's talking about the enslaved people on sugar plantations in Haiti in 1791, then known as Saint-Domingue, when the revolution broke out. And James writes, working and living together in gangs of hundreds on the huge sugar factories which covered the northern plain. That's the northern plain of the colony of Saint-Domingue. They were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time. And the rising, the uprising, was therefore a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. So I want you to note a couple of things about this passage before I take it down. First, James is looking at the revolution and he's saying to himself, this was a minutely organized plan. As some of you will know, eventually Toussaint Louverture commands an army of tens of thousands of formerly enslaved peoples, which defeats in turn the Spanish, the French, and the British armies. So what does this tell us about this group of people as a class? That something about their lives facilitated a thoroughly prepared and organized mass movement. And James, I think rightly, is linking this to the fact that they worked, this is back to the first two lines, that they worked and lived together in gangs of hundreds. They had a highly collectivized form of social and economic life, and this manifests itself politically in the Haitian Revolution. And James rightly points out that these were some of the largest workplaces in the world in 1791, these enormous estates. We have probably an average size of a sugar plantation in Saint-Domingue and the British Caribbean at this point. Probably the average size is around 300 bonded workers. You have some as high as maybe 800 or 900. So these are mass workplaces. And James is tying the character of the Haitian Revolution to precisely this fact, that this mode of life, which he says is essentially a modern one, characterizes their existence. It's with this in mind that I make the argument that enslaved workers constituted living labor in the production process. When we look at Marx's basic theoretical concepts for capital, he argues that capitalist production requires the bringing together of living labor and constant capital. Constant capital consists of tools, raw materials, buildings, and machines. These elements are constant, says Marx, because the value they contain does not grow. The value they represent does not grow. They cannot produce new value or surplus value for the capitalist because they're inanimate forms of capital. They're necessary. You need all these elements, tools, raw materials, buildings, and machines. But it is, Marx argues, under capitalism, living labor that produces new value, more value than what it cost to mobilize and put into motion. And it seems very clear to me that if the plantation complex was immensely profitable, and by the way, I go through all the debates on the profitability of the plantation system, and the evidence is overwhelming. The low end estimates are about a 7 to 8% per year return on capital to planters who own plantations. Now, by the way, that's a very good capitalist investment, 7 to 8% return a year. But we know that larger plantations were often returning in the 12 to 15% range. So once again, the averages are somewhat concealing the true degree of profitability for the largest plantations. And so my argument is that the planter class was buying labor power when it bought enslaved people, but this was bonded labor power. And that as a result, the claim that it was constant capital collapses on two key grounds. First of all, the surplus value had to be coming from somewhere. And only living labor, not constant capital, can produce surplus value. So these were, and by the way, this is entirely what Marx says in Volume 1 of Capital as well, where he says the production of surplus value itself had become the foundation of the plantation system in the US South in the 18th century. That's for those who are really interested in the quote. That's on page 345 of Volume 1 of Capital in the Penguin edition. In addition, not only does constant capital not produce surplus value, but critical to my argument is that constant capital also does not strike. Only living labor strikes. Only actual human producers. Now, if there's time in the discussion period, I'll tell you a little bit more about Marx's views. I spend a lot of time in the book on a particular passage from Volume 3 of Capital, where Marx talks also about enslaved people as producers of surplus value. But although Fred was very generous in saying that I have as long as I want, I'm not going to do that. Let me now turn to the forms of struggle, because as I said to you, class formation means that the forms of struggle and resistance are definitive of social classes. And so I want to share with you two lines of argument that I make in the book with respect to enslaved people. I look at a modality of forms of resistance that don't constitute strikes, and then I look at actual strikes, including mass strikes that were waged by enslaved people. But let me start with the non-strike forms. As the diaries of the planter class, their journals and so on tell us, theft was epidemic in the plantation complex. Enslaved people stole all the time from the master class. But what's fascinating is the moral justification they use. And that moral justification, as I argue in the book, constitutes a labor ethic. Over and over and over again, enslaved people, when writing about the experience or disciplined for theft, argue that it was not stealing. And it was not stealing, they say, because they created that wealth. They essentially put forward what we would call a rudimentary labor theory of value. We have every right to this object, whatever it is, that we have stolen or our children have stolen because we produce that wealth. And they say it over and over and over again. In fact, the dominant term in the enslaved community was not theft. Theft only was when you did it to one of your own neighbors, to a fellow worker. Then it was theft. Otherwise, it was appropriation. And appropriation is the term that runs through enslaved discourse. To me, this is a proletarian moral economy. This is a moral economy based on a labor theory of value, according to which workers have the right to everything they produce. And if someone takes some of their product, they have the right to appropriate it, to take it back, because the wealth has been stolen from them. But they are its true owners. The second axis that I really emphasize is struggles over time. Marx says to us in Capital and in a number of speeches he gave for the First International that the struggle for the 10-hour day in Britain was the most important struggle because it represented, quote, the political economy of the working class, unquote. Wages struggles don't do that. They don't do that because they don't reclaim time, the time of human life and human existence, from capital. The struggle to reduce working hours is a struggle to reclaim life from capital. It's a struggle to reappropriate our life energies and the times of our lives. And one of the fascinating things going through the archives was to see how often enslaved people fought for more time away from the fields. To give you just one example, by the 1830s, most enslaved people in Martinique had won 2 days away from mandatory labor, both Saturdays and Sundays. And this had come out of huge social struggles. And over and over and over again, you see governors of the colony of Martinique, as well as planters saying, the one thing we cannot do is to try to take away their Saturday. There will be a general revolt if we do that. And in Haiti, not surprisingly, when the mass assemblies of enslaved workers started to take place in 1793 and 1794, while the revolution was in its greatest upswing, over and over again, when the assemblies of plantation workers would happen, the demand for more days off, at one point they got to the point where the demand for 3 days away from field labor had become the norm. And then I show how this same theme resurfaces in a revolt in Demerara in 1823 and so on. So on the one hand, the struggle over time, what Marx calls the political economy of the working class, was central. I also devote a lot of time to the question of what they were reclaiming and argue that they were reclaiming time for social reproduction, for their reproduction as humans and the reproduction of their kin networks and of their communities. This is time for gardening, for play, for socializing, for prayer, for music making, dancing, storytelling. This is the time where people recompose themselves as human beings outside of the process of exploitative labor. And social reproduction, as Marxist feminists have said to us, is all about the life making that working class people do in opposition to capital. And for me, of course, it's clear that Black women were fundamentally central to this process. And one of the things I try to do is to recenter the role of Black women in these struggles over social reproduction in enslaved communities. Now, the final axis of resistance that I want to point to, and here I'll just offer a few concluding comments after this, has to do with the use of the strike and the mass strike by enslaved people. Because as one Jamaican historian has put it, there was a constant process of collective bargaining going on in the plantation complex. It's just that in the face of the whip, in the face of the regime of terror that the plantation regime consisted of, to collectively bargain meant to strike, to withdraw labor. Collective bargaining required mass protest, and the most effective way was the withdrawal of labor. Now, enslaved people used strikes for very short-term immediate gains often, but also for much larger and more significant kinds of actions like reducing work time. And one of the things we discover is that they particularly used it to get rid of vicious overseers. More than anything else, when they resorted to large-scale strike action, they were doing it to get managers or overseers dismissed. And they regularly won these battles. Regularly, the planter realized that it was worth dumping an overseer to get the production of sugar or cotton or tobacco or what have you restarted. Enslaved people regularly won these kinds of struggles, and we need to recognize that. It was as terroristic as the plantation regime was, enslaved people carved out a whole series of rights to their own gardens, to time out of the fields, and so on. And as I show in the book, this is why money wages were so widespread. If you reduced the workday to 9 hours through your collective struggle, if you got half of Saturday and all of Sunday off, if the planter wanted your time, he had to pay. And we find that huge numbers of enslaved people regularly earned money wages on, quote, their own time. But imagine that concept, and planters use it, by the way, on their own time. I found one document in a particular planter archive where a Mississippi planter says, paid Negro Tom $5 for hauling logs on his own time. Now think of the fact. This is chattel slavery, but the planter is referring to this man Tom's own time, time that belonged to him. And that's because enslaved people fought and won these limits on their exploitation and their domination. Let me come now to mass strikes, and I'm going to try to share again with you. And I'm going to move ahead once more to this image. And it allows me to discuss with you a series of mass strikes beginning from 1795 and running for the next 70 years through to the end of the US Civil War. August of 1795, a strike by 1,000 enslaved workers in Curacao mushrooms into a month-long multiracial rebellion of armed black slaves, mulattoes, free blacks, and zombos, people of mixed indigenous and African descent. 3 years later, October 1798, tens of thousands of enslaved workers in Saint-Domingue respond to a call by Toussaint Louverture for strikes against French colonialism. And as Carolyn Fick shows us in her book on the revolution from below in Haiti, they were drawing here on a repertoire that went back at least a decade, probably longer, of plantation strikes that developed in waves prior to the uprising of 1791. When Toussaint Louverture called for mass strikes against the French, when Napoleon was reinvading the colony, when he called for those strikes, he knew that this was not a novelty. It was not an innovation. He could call on them to do something they had done before. April 1816, Buss's revolt in Barbados begins with a wave of plantation strikes advocated by a strike leader named Nanny Grigg. And Nanny Grigg had preached, don't run to the woods, strike. Lay down tools. August 1823, a revolt of over 10,000 slaves in the British colony of Demerara follows a call to lay down their tools for freedom. And that term, by the way, to lay down their tools or to lay down our tools, recurs in all of the police and state investigations. Perhaps most famously in the West Indies, Christmas and New Year's 1831-32, when at least 30,000 Jamaican bond people refused work as part of an uprising that hastened abolition in the British colonies. As one enslaved person told a commissioner afterwards, Sharp, that's enslaved Reverend Sharp, Sharp said we must sit down. So notice these classically working class idioms. Lay down our tools. Sit down. These ideas of immobilizing the labor process through a mass withdrawal of labor power. And then finally, of course, 1861 to 65 in the United States, W.E.B. Du Bois's General Strike of the Slaves, which involves the withdrawal of close to 500,000 enslaved people from the South who get themselves behind Union lines. And as Du Bois recognized, this has a crippling economic effect. This mass withdrawal of labor power from the Confederacy is crippling economically, but moreover, it also involves the entry of about 200,000 African American men into the Union Army and Navy, who then repurpose that labor power to actually bring down the Confederacy militarily. And I'll just say that historians have recently started to much more also emphasize something Du Bois doesn't here, the reproductive strike, the flight by women with their children out of the South, who are also therefore withdrawing the means of reproducing the chattel proletariat from the South. So when I show you that, I hope it gives some sense of just how significant the use of the mass strike was by enslaved people. And it allows me, I hope, to conclude by saying that in addition to trying to show that the plantation complex was a capitalist operation, and that's what I really try to lay out in the first part of the book, ultimately, I think the test is class formation and class struggle. And if we have a class of people who imbibed a labor ethic with respect to the wealth they produced and their right to appropriate it, that regularly fought for time away from forced labor in the fields and the other parts of the complex, who use slowdowns and strikes and even mass strikes. Because I would argue that this use of the mass strike rivals anything else that we can find in Europe during the same decades. We do see some mass strikes, particularly by textile workers, but these strikes of what I call the chattel proletariat rival anything that we see in Europe, particularly in the period from the 1790s to the 1830s. So not only am I trying to argue that New World slavery is an intrinsic part of the history of capitalism, I'm also trying to insist that the struggles of enslaved people actually constitute fundamental aspects of the history of the international working class. That when we teach global labor history, these should not be treated as something separate. These are parts of the history of the international working class. It's time that we integrated this history into the way in which we do international working class and global labor history. So let me stop there. I've gone probably as long as I should have, and I look forward to the questions, challenges, and comments that you want to offer. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. We are now able to move into the question and comment section of the event, and you may either type your question or comment in the chat if you'd prefer not to go on camera. That's perfectly fine. Or you may type the word stack, S-T-A-C-K, in the chat, and we will add you to the speaker's stack. Or you can use the raise hand function in your Zoom interface under the React button at the bottom of your screen. So let's start with Walter Molina.
Hello, Professor. Hello, everyone from Los Angeles, California. Professor, I have your book. I'm like on page 70. I swear, it took me 2 hours to read 10 pages because it's really a study. And I really appreciate all the work that you put into it. And it challenges me to look up stuff and really learn. My question is, I'm a little confused with the concrete labor versus the variable labor. I understand concrete or constant labor is the raw materials, the machinery, and variable capital is the human labor, right? Mm-hmm. My question is, I'm a little confused. Are you saying that the bonds people were also constant capital or just variable capital? I'm a little bit confused because under what I see in my very little experience is that they were both, because they were like the machines of this enterprise, as well as obviously the human labor. So if you could just kind of elucidate that for me in the most rudimentary way, I'd be so grateful. Thank you.
David, do you want to take one at a time, or you want to take two or three?
Fred, I think you should watch your list and see if it makes more sense to take a couple at a time, or what?
Why don't we go ahead with this one, and then we'll go to Peter Fine.
Okay. Walter, it's a great question. And by the way, I am always David, not Professor. We're comrades.
Hermano.
So my own view of this is that there are two levels at which the planter capitalist bought enslaved labor power. First, they make a one-time only purchase, which gives them the legal ownership of the person. That's why they're a chattel proletarian. And then there is a regular stream of payments that they make because there has to be food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and so on for these enslaved people. Now, to me, those payments are what Marx calls, and also you really see Lenin using this term in studies in the development of capitalism, these are wages in kind. Wages don't have to be paid in money. They can be paid in kind. And so those annual and sometimes weekly and even daily payments of food, clothing, shelter, medical care, those are definitely wages in kind. But essentially then what the capitalist also does, the planter capitalist, is that they make what for accounting purposes does look like a constant payment. They buy the person. Okay. And that goes into their accounting system as a relatively constant cost. Now, it's not really constant for two reasons. First, about 15% of enslaved people were actually leased out or rented out for part of the year. Labor is much more mobile in the plantation complex than people think. And probably another 10 to 15% were sold and resold every year. So essentially, what they're doing is they're making a payment to immobilize labor power. Okay, to keep labor power constantly there for them. And by the way, this was a huge issue in the whole of colonial capitalism. The reason that different kinds of bonded labor, from indentured labor to slavery, are used so widely is because, given the opportunity, most proletarianized people, if the opportunity exists, will run away and farm land for themselves. Marx laughs about this problem in The Grundrisse when he writes about Jamaica, and he laughs about it in Capital when he writes about Australia. He has this case of a poor Mr. Peel, as he calls him, who brought hundreds of laborers to the outback of Australia to work crops for him, and they all ran away. They just squatted and took land of their own. So in these kinds of contexts, they have to pay a kind of price to immobilize that labor. And so it has the appearance, as you say, of a constant capital payment. But my argument is, but it's a payment for labor power, in the same way that when the capitalist buys you for 8 hours and you can't leave. If you walk out, say, I'm done with this crap, and right? You can't. You lose the job. You get disciplined, whatever. And so, yes, there is that one-time only payment. And it's a payment to freeze labor power in place. And then there's ongoing variable capital payments that are made as wages in kind. My crucial point is to say that what's being bought is living labor. And after that one-time only payment, which is like, it's similar in kind to the payment that a capitalist makes when they pay an indentured laborer's voyage across the Atlantic. Okay? It's a necessary payment to procure this labor and freeze it in place. Okay? But it's not constant capital in the way in which Marx describes constant capital as those elements like buildings, et cetera, that you're buying products of labor, of human labor, whose value you then reap over a bunch of production cycles. So I hope I give you a little bit of help with that one, but I know because it's a chattel proletariat, it's more difficult conceptually. I agree.
Thank you.
Let's try this time taking 3 at once and see how that works. We'll go to Peter Fay, then Steve from Seattle, and then Tarika.
Okay. This will be interesting to answer 3 at once. But my question a little bit involved. So first, let's, I guess I should at least preface this by saying, these categories of purchasing labor, surplus value with no variable capital on the other side, all these categories really require an existing purchase of a commodity, which of course is labor power. So I really don't see any of these categories precisely matching anything that Marx said, but that's not really what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at actually is this question of, is this a new perspective on slavery? I mean, Jonathan Swift said everything old is new again, and I see this over and over again in academia. People come up with new ways of looking at things, which turn out to be not quite as new as we think. The idea of mass strikes. So, when I learned about slavery, this was long before the new, studies, new studies on capital and slavery. I read Herbert Aptheker and his American Negro Slave Revolts. He talked about mass strikes. He talked about destruction of property. He said, and this is a quote from him, from the American Negro Slave Revolts. He said, most slaves were owned as investments, not as ornaments, etc. Slaves were instruments of production, were means by which men who owned land were able to produce tobacco, rice, and sugar, cotton, to be sold and return them a profit. Their existence had no meaning other than this for the employers. Profit must be gotten from these workers, from whom the bosses own, no matter what blood and sweat and tears this entailed, and the more profit, the better. Okay, so a profit-making enterprise was acknowledged in, when was this, 1943 when he wrote this. He talked about sabotage, shamming illness, stealing, suicide, self-mutilation, and strikes were the other devices which plagued slaveholders. And he goes on and on to all the different examples of how, the slaves interrupted and struck against their owners, which, this is one of the many examples of where research and Marxist analysis of slavery was suppressed by academia. And I don't even see this reference to this book in your bibliography, but obviously you know about it. And I'm wondering what you think of, obviously Genovese came up with his theories of, a feudal type slavery, but what do you think of the early writers, including like you cited Du Bois, other Marxists that, recognized this essential component of slavery being capitalism? How is what we're seeing now anything really essentially new from what we've seen in previous generations of Marxists?
Okay, thanks, Peter. Steve from Seattle, you want to pose your question?
Hi, thanks very much. And David, I thought your book was fantastic. I think it really, to me, settles the question of whether slaves are constant capital or not, and whether slavery in the South was part of capitalism. I think it's a fantastic book. But the question I want to ask you mentioned a couple of times in the book that that plantation owners would have preferred wage labor, but because the conditions able to run away and so forth, they were not able to. There was no labor market that they could pull out of except for through chattel slavery. So I'd like you to talk about, do you see a fundamental, any kind of real contradiction between chattel ownership and the drives of capitalism for accumulation, displacement of labor, flexibility, etc.? And then how does this relate to coercion of wage labor? Is something that sometimes people don't really get into very much, but the whole creation of the proletariat in England, which came about because of physical force by the state, trying to go off the land, et cetera, et cetera. So how does your analysis relate to the coercion of actual wage labor as well? Oh, thanks a lot.
Okay, and a question from Tarika.
Hey, thanks so much for your work. I'm leading another group on MEP on animals and capitalism, and the recurring question that comes up there is the question of whether non-commodified labor can produce surplus value. Like, of course, we talk about commodified non-human life. And there's a lot of new work that's come up. Dinesh Wadiwell has made the argument that you could consider the upkeeping of non-human animals as equivalent of a wage from the point of view of capitalists. And so what you've been saying here is really inspiring as a contribution to that conversation, because I feel like there is resonance in thinking of value production, not necessarily like class formation. Obviously, there are big differences between, human labor force and non-human entities, but like typically non-human animals, for example, have been theorized in Marxism, I guess, like as constant capital, but also more recently as lively commodities or something like this. And there's a real resistance to think of them as laborers in the sense of like value producing labor. And so I'd be really interested in hearing how far you can stretch that notion of wage and non-commodified wage as value producing. Thank you.
Take it away, David.
Okay, so I'll take those three then. Let me just take them in order. Peter's points. Yeah. Look, I'm trying to be very clear in this book. I say it at the outset that the book takes inspiration from three great Marxist figures who've written in this area. C.L.R. James, who I cited, W.E.B. Du Bois, whose General Strike of the Slaves I finished my comments with, and Sylvia Wynter, who at the time where she was working on her unpublished Black Metamorphosis actually used the term plantation proletariat. Now, what's interesting is that I think in terms of Peter's question, that all of those theorists were less committed to, and in some cases explicitly not committed to, the kind of position that was coming out of Communist Party circles at the time, that because, Genovese's position that the South was not capitalist has its connections to the Communist Party's very doctrinaire way of understanding modes of production. And in James's case, and it's obvious, he simply was always an anti-Stalinist. And Du Bois, I believe, was developing a thesis on the general strike of the slaves that pushed in a direction that was radically outside the way that others associated with Communist Party circles like Herbert Aptheker had thought about it. So you're absolutely right, Peter. Aptheker has some wonderful discussions of resistance and revolt. My problem is that it's still integrated in the idea that there was a conflict of two different social systems and two different modes of production between North and South in the United States. I don't think that's what the Civil War was about. Marx has this very interesting formulation where he says it's a conflict between two different forms of labor. And I think there's a very important element of truth to that, even though it has to be unpacked. So even when Aptheker says in the passage, Peter, that you quote, that enslaved people were instruments of production, it's the instruments that I'm challenging. They weren't instruments. They were animate, living humans. And I know this is going to come back to Tarika's point in a moment as well. Steve Lee, thank you for those comments. And yes, I think you really touch on a critical question. And this is the position that Eric Williams sets out in Capitalism and Slavery, even though Williams, I think is absolutely wrong when he believes that that slavery was abolished because the slave system became inefficient and unprofitable. I see no evidence of that. All the data we have for the 1860s in the United States, the 1850s in the United States, just before the outbreak of the Civil War, is enormously profitable production on the plantation system. I believe it was the revolts from below that terminated the system of slavery. But Eric Williams does make this claim, and you're right that I cite it, that the planters would have preferred wage labor, but they couldn't get it. Simply wasn't available in New World circumstances. And I think what that question is getting at is really the capitalist class prefers labor as precarious as possible, as insecure, unsupported, and therefore, quote, ripe for exploitation as possible. And so they want to make as few commitments to the human and physical well-being of the working class as possible. They prefer, as I say, an insecure and precarious class. One of the contradictions which comes up in Walter's important question at the beginning is that because they needed to make these initial one-time only investments in procuring labor power and securing it, they now take on for themselves a certain kind of responsibility for its maintenance. Now, I argue that the system of leasing and renting out bonded workers and also of selling them meant that they could shed labor whenever they needed to. But nevertheless, they're stuck with a responsibility for annual payments in housing, annual payments in clothing, and so on. And so the drive to precarity is probably their ideal. The problem is you must have mass surpluses of labor power to make that work. You have to have massively dispossessed millions and millions from the land and have them available for exploitation. And that takes a long time. It took probably 300 years to really get there in England, for instance. And even if the process gets more compressed in the New World, still takes a long time to monopolize all the land, to prevent squatting, and so on. And so, yes, I do think that there's, if you will, a long-term logic, Steve, in terms of your point, towards precarious wage labor. But along that route, a modality of forms of bondage are possible, from particularly indentured labor and chattel labor. And you're absolutely right that massive violence is required to create that precarity. That's what the so-called primitive accumulation in Europe is all about, as Marx tells us. The violence of driving people from their lands. And then the violence of the mad scramble for gold in the Americas, the commercial hunting of black skins, those are directly Marx's words, in Africa, and so on. So yes, what we're always talking about is simply a continuum of violence and coercion within capitalism. And chattel slavery, chattel labor is at one endpoint in that continuum. Okay, Tarika, I am still working through my own thinking on this question, so I'm not going to claim to be able to do it justice. But the question that you're raising is one that I think a lot of eco-Marxists are thinking about right now, which is what happens when capital also seizes as a productive force non-human living creatures. Mules, for example, are widespread in the plantation complex that I'm talking about. And what do we need there to begin to think about other forces of production that are not living human labor? It's not what they are. They're not being organized in the same way generally speaking. They don't resist in the same way, but nevertheless, there is a surplus product that's perhaps being generated through the mobilization of their animate energies. And for me, this is a question that really needs a lot more thinking and theorizing. I'm delighted to hear that you're part of discussion groups that are doing that. And I just, I would love to learn more about where some of those discussions are at, because I think as we take the eco-Marxist turn seriously, these are questions we need to spend a lot more time with.
Great. Moving right along, we have questions from Steve Backman, Linda Lowe, and I just wondered if Carol or Mark would like to amplify or repeat what they have in the chat comments. But let's start with Steve.
Hi, everyone, and hi, David. Glad you are here. And I have not yet had the chance to read the book, and hearing you talk, I'm more excited than even before to get a copy of it and read it. And your comment just now is a good lead-in to what I wanted to bring up. Because it seems like a number of the questions, and then your comment just now, are pointing to things that are, let's say, at the edge of the main thrust of the book and your argument. On the book, the description seems like it would most apply to the largest plantations, and the largest plantations in the most stable areas of commodity production. So not commodities that were in decline, say tobacco after a while, and so on. And also larger ones, because of something that I had to step out for a minute, but I don't believe you talked about, which is that some of the people working on the plantation as enslaved people were working to the benefit of the planter class, and, as far as I know, also to the reproduction of the enslaved peoples. That is, they were working, in the plantation house, making food, washing clothes, taking care of kids, repairing tools, all this kind of stuff, repairing household tools. And that labor would not be subject to the same degree of large scale gang or organization and so on and so forth. I don't know what proportion it is, but when you add that group to what you described, and you've referred a couple times to, say, the 15% or so of enslaved people that were sold each year, and then additional people who were leased out, it seems like, again, depending upon the size of the plantation and the stability of what it was producing, a significant number of people were working outside of the large-scale field agriculture. And are those people exceptions, or is it a different kind of a relationship, or is it like the different kinds of labor that might even be present in a large, manufacturing plant and so on and so forth? But it just seems like it has to be taken into account. For example, I'll just give a couple examples and then I'll stop. You mentioned that the plantation owners have something like the ability of factory owners to, fire people or lay people off because they can sell people that they don't need or want. But in a factory, the people who are being laid off or fired or whatever can be driven completely to the margins, and that's all to the better, like made even more precarious, to use the word that you were using. But on the plantation, if the plantation owner is thinking of selling off some people, he has to take into account the decrease in the sale price if, he beats them almost to death or so on and so forth. In other words, the calculation of precarity is a little bit different. Just to take one example that jumped out to me from what you were saying. I don't know, maybe I should stop there because I think you get the idea. I feel like maybe this is in the book and you just don't want to cover it today. Maybe this is on the margin, or maybe it's something that needs to be incorporated into the argument. Because 15% being sold off is still a pretty significant number of people per year. And oh yeah, I'll just mention one other thing. I know I said I'd just stick with that one example. I had a couple of them, but one other one. When you refer to people running away from historical things that I've read, the running away had a lot to do with the threat of families being broken up for sale, as opposed to being pushed over the edge in the field production. So I don't know, it seems like there's nuance that needs to be added. And I'll stop there.
David, why don't you go ahead and take Steve's comments, and then we'll take people one at a time for a while.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. At one level, part of what you're raising, Steve, is the question of the reproductive labor of predominantly, but not exclusively, Black women in the big house, in the planter household, which is part of the appropriation of labor for purposes of personal care, well-being, cooking, cleaning, looking after children, and so on. And there's no question that is part of the complex. I do discuss those things. The argument that I want to make is that if we use the big house as the starting point for trying to understand the New World plantation complex, we often run into problems because then it looks like it's just the direct exploitation for use. And we miss the fact that this is an enormous machinery of commodity production. But I don't want to deny these other areas of labor at all. My point really around the 15% that you're talking about was less about sale and more about leasing. You see, one of the historians who makes the argument, well, it had to be constant capital because real capitalists can hire and fire and they can shed labor as they need to. And my argument simply is if we look at the data, it's very, very clear that there was a lot of movement of labor in any one year between enterprises. 15% or so leased out every year. In other words, they've become surplus to requirements on one estate, but there's lots of need for them on another. Say the harvest is over on one estate, but in another estate, there's going to be a month of rebuilding and fixing fences, and they need surplus labor. So my argument here, really, the central point is that there's more mobility of labor. It's a more flexible labor market than a lot of people have pointed out. And that's really what I'm trying to drive home. In terms of running away, yes, overwhelmingly, running away had two primary causes: physical violence. Someone had taken a beating, or they ran away in order to refuse to take a beating. Number one. And number two, family reunification. Members of the household had been sold off, and so people flee in order to reunite, often knowing that they're only getting days together. You know, one of the things I didn't get into my presentation, but I do in the book, is that the majority of flights away from the plantation were short-term with a plan of returning. They weren't absolutely determined flights to freedom as a permanent thing. They were in order to slow down the labor process, as a form of protest, and as a form of going and spending time with kin and loved ones. And that's a pattern that we see across this complex. But most importantly, it's a form of reasserting life and life-making. And it's a form of defiance of control from above. All right. Let's
Linda
go,
Love.
right?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the book and for this talk, David. I want to ask if you would expand on two things, especially the first. You describe Bon people as thinkers, political and abstract thinkers, which suggests a variable consciousness and self-awareness, and certainly not an idea of sameness or as things. And with that self-awareness of exploitation and the resolve to resist, that really enhances the idea of their humanity. And you talked about distinct doctrines of emancipation that were developed by Bon's people and often pushing the boundaries of their visions of what were possible for freedom or even just for rights without freedom. And these were sometimes brought to legislative bodies or lawyers or other bodies that would then make determinations that could actually expand on their rights. So I think that's a fascinating thing that I had not before ever really thought about in terms of things that people formulated, whether they could write them or not. And interestingly, sometimes one of the consequences was being able to learn to read and write. And I just thought that consciousness and self-awareness as thinkers was an important point. The fact that the Union forces, when in the Civil War period, when there was more and more interaction with them, the fact that despite the fact that this was supposed to be the North fighting to abolish slavery, in fact, there were many efforts by some of those forces to dampen the expectations of what could happen with freedom. And I know it's a very different thing, but I couldn't help thinking of something today where some leading Democratic Party politicians de facto work to reduce and limit and constrain expectations of what will be possible if you vote for us. So I know that's a huge leap through centuries. Last point that you really wrote a lot about, but and has been somewhat in this discussion, related to women slaves, Black women in particular, and the tension between the need to increase surplus value in the here and now, which would argue for working them as hard as possible, versus what it would take to assure an adequate birth rate and the reproduction of more slaves, especially in key regions where that was more difficult. So I just think that's interesting because that also led to laws being changed, or even if the laws didn't change, practices de facto changing. And I thought that those were important points that I really gained a lot from. That's it.
Fred, shall I comment on that, or do you
Yeah,
want to take some more?
let me just interject here, Carol Barton's question, because I think it's related to what Linda was
Perfect.
talking about. She says in the chat, aside from enslaved people's surplus labor, what about the profit from buying and selling slaves, and in particular the ownership of the offspring of slaves? How does that get categorized?
Wonderful. Yeah, let me take those two together. Linda, it allows me to start with your last point, and then proceed from there. This tension at the heart of the plantation complex is really one where we see this really quite compelling conflict around gender and class, or between production and reproduction. The drive for surplus value says work women as long and as hard as possible, even if pregnant in the fields, because once you remove them from the fields, then you're losing that daily production. Your production quotas are not being hit, and so on. But on the other hand, the fact of these one-time only payments for labor power, and this touches directly on what Carol is raising as well, the fact of those one-time only productions means that if you can have a self-sustaining birth rate, then you don't have to go back into the market for labor power to buy new chattel humans, because women on the plantation are reproducing them, producing and reproducing them for you. And so that tension is there. But, and this, Linda, goes right to your central point, it's a tension that enslaved people understood and they pushed on. In other words, they fought to get pregnant women field workers out of the fields earlier and earlier and earlier. We've got this wonderful example that Stephanie Camp records in her book that I refer to, which is that she finds a plantation in which the community of enslaved people tells one young male, you're going to run to the forest and you're going to hide out until we tell you to come back, because the master and the overseer aren't letting Mary out of the field, even though she's going to give birth soon. So this young man runs to the forest. The next day, the overseer wants to know where they are. And the community says, he's gone to the forest. He's not coming back until you take Mary out of the field. In other words, what Mary Turner, the Jamaican historian, described as collective bargaining. Well, we've got it right there. But you strike first and then bargain, right? It's a very interesting dynamic. You withdraw some labor power and then you bargain. And this has got to do with a whole development driven by Black women primarily of cultures of birthing that they establish control over. Because again, remember, these planters are completely imbued with modern Enlightenment Western science. So they decide they want to bring in white doctors to do deliveries. And the Black women just overwhelmingly refuse. There's one case of a plantation in Jamaica where they try to pay the women to deliver to these white doctors. And no, they're sticking with their own Black midwives. So they're establishing a degree of control over reproduction collectively. And it's fascinating to think about that in these larger conflicts over life-making that I was talking about. And then you can see how critical the whole process of childbearing and child nurturing and child raising becomes. Because one of the things that's also clear is we now know that, contrary to the myth, the majority of enslaved children grew up with two parents. And they fought for the integrity of those marriages and those child rearing relations. Everything from naming children, when the planter insisted on naming them, The children all had a different name in the community. When you were in the slave quarters, they weren't called what the planter said they were called, and so on. This is all a struggle to control life and to create cultural forms from birthing to child rearing to family formation, kinship networks, and of course, everything that goes with that: storytelling, spiritual practice, music, all of those cultural elements. And, when Robin Kelly talks about the freedom dream, these freedom dreams had these very material forms that particularly pivoted around struggles over life and life making. So thank you both for those points. But Linda, also the point you started on, bonds people as thinkers. One of the things I really try to underline is this was, as much as they tried to seal the plantation off from the world, planters couldn't do it. And they couldn't do it because if you're going to now get all of these bales of cotton or all of these barrels of sugar to the port city, well, who's driving the wagons? Who's unloading the wagons when you get to the port city? Well, okay, so bond people are now going to the cities. Oh, and who are they hanging out with and talking with as they start to load the stuff onto ships? They're talking to sailors from France and sailors from England. And, the French sailors are saying that the king's been overthrown. Okay, and so in Port-au-Prince, these stories are coming back to the plantations. And what we're seeing is, you're absolutely right, we're seeing enslaved people who were upholding the doctrine of human rights, insisting that they bore rights, that they had rights. They were embracing republicanism. They were embracing theories of democracy. And this was not simply the implantation of Western theories. We now know, and we've got some great studies of this, they were radicalizing the doctrines that they were hearing about, say, the rights of man from France. They were radicalizing and deepening them. And of course, they had to, because they had to push the doctrine of the rights of man all the way to abolitionism. And to push it all the way to abolitionism was to challenge property rights. It was to say that the rights of man couldn't be contained within legal boundaries of life, liberty, and property, because at least some property had to be expropriated. And that's the amazing thing, of course, about the emancipation of enslaved people, is that they are appropriating themselves. They are decommodifying themselves. And that gives an enormous push. The final point I'll make on this is that, isn't it interesting that in the 1860s, when the International Working Men's Association appears, that a term appears regularly now in Marx's writings. Remember, Marx is writing an enormous amount of journalism and letters about the Civil War in the United States. As a couple of people have pointed out, the Civil War in the United States is the longest revolutionary upheaval of Marx's lifetime. He studies it and writes about it for nearly 5 years. And then he writes about its aftermath as well. This is when he really learns about slavery and abolition in the United States. And bracket point that I make in my final chapter, the most important Marxists of the 1850s and 1860s were moving in the same circles as John Brown. They were abolitionists. Is Mark Louse still on this call? Because if Mark is still here, a huge shout out to the writing that Mark has done in this area. You must read Mark Louse's books on these questions, several of them with the University of Illinois. And I cite Mark quite regularly on this in the book. There was a fusion of Marxism and abolitionism to the point where we get a Marxist general during the Civil War, as someone has pointed out, the only communist general in the history of the United States, and it happens during the Civil War. So, and the term, though, that I want to highlight here is Marx says to us in the instructions for the International Working Men's Association, the emancipation of the working class is the task of the workers themselves. And Robin Blackburn quite rightly has said, notice how the term emancipation is the one that Marx is using here in 1861. This is not accidental. This is a term that has re-entered his vocabulary because of the struggles of self-emancipating people in the United States. The very terminology of emancipation becomes the terminology for global working class liberation. And I think it's a reminder to us of how central abolitionism was to the Marxist project, and therefore gives us a way of thinking about the struggles around race and class today.
David, I'm wondering if I could just do a quick follow-up question. It was thank you for getting into social reproduction, and I really appreciate the feminist analysis. My question was more sort of a technical one, as I'm trying to understand, that enslaved people are creating surplus value, but then you have these other ways that they're profiting, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we categorize that? That's not so much social reproduction as I'm breeding slaves to sell them. There's other ways that they're making money that became part of the banking system and the finance system of the United States, right? So I'm wondering how you're understanding that.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Carol, for that clarification. So I'm seeing it as a deliberate process in the first instance of expanding the labor force. And as you say, then there are multiple options. In many, many cases, enslaved children start to get put to work on the so-called third gang by about age 4 or 5. So they're becoming direct living labor in the plantation system in childhood. And again, some of the new work on enslaved childhoods is, I think, quite fascinating in this regard. But also, as you say, if they are, quote, surplus to requirements, then they can be fully commodified and put on the market for other buyers of enslaved labor power. So there are these two roads to profit through biosocial reproduction of a new generation of enslaved labor powers. One is their direct input into the plantation system, and the other is, as you say, being commodified. In either case, they can be used, as you say, in the credit system, because very often loans could be taken with enslaved people as collateral. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they're also a financial asset, and it's a horrific thing to say, but it is the reality of planter capitalism. They are a more, quote, liquid asset, unquote, than land. Land, the sale of land is always more complicated. The sale of bonded labor power was always ready. There was always a market for it. So that your ability to use, very often, planters got better rates for borrowing if they used enslaved people as collateral than if they used land. Mm-hmm. So as you say, we've got this nexus here of production, the slave market itself, and the credit system in the South. And all three are converging around the enslaved body. The enslaved body is the nexus of all of them.
Thanks.
Mark Laws, you had a comment in the chat earlier. I wondered if you wanted to say anything directly, or we could pass on.
Well, thank you for the shout out. I just want to say, I think the idea that we are now able to talk about slaveholders as capitalist is remarkable, that it's taken that long for us to get to this point, isn't it? Our slaves as workers. And I think that those are distinctions, we were talking about it in terms of a sort of doctrinaire Marxism. maybe a better description would be a doctrinaire materialism. It seems to be more of a obsession with that than with class identities. What hits me when you go to the sources and you really start digging into them is, I don't think, coming from a border state, I don't think that Missouri had a single industrialist going into the Civil War that wasn't also a slaveholder. Right? And not just in the slave states. In Cincinnati, the principal industrialists always were putting a lot of their capital into the land. So you had people like Miles Greenwood that owned hundreds of acres of land in Kentucky, all worked by slaves. So what does that make him? Is he a capitalist on this side of the Ohio and a not a capitalist on the other side of the Ohio? Is it the class identity that is strobing? You were touching on that question about slaves carving out their own time and being able to work for wages. This is something that's really a difficult area in terms of getting at the sources, but it's terribly important, especially in these border cities, but also I think in the countryside as well, in terms of organizing what becomes a black movement in a city like Louisville. Well, in any of these communities, really, you have to look at things like Prince Hall Masonry, Black Freemasonry. Blacks were not allowed to be Masons in terms of the regular York Rite Masonry. And so they sort of formed their own coming out of the British Army. I think that should cause some sleepless nights to Ken Burns, but it probably won't. But if you were a African American in the colonies and you were looking in the Revolution as the quickest way to get free, you were not looking to George Washington to do it. But this organization of their own churches, their own Masonic lodges, recalls in cases like Louisville and other border cities that you had lodges that consisted of free blacks, slaves, and people who were slaves but were also had carved out their own time. And in order to not cause trouble, and they would cause trouble if they would get caught having their own Masonic lodge in a slave state, every month for their Masonic meetings, they would sneak down to the Ohio River in boats and cross over the Ohio River to Indiana and hold their lodge meetings in a free state. And they did this every damn month. Right? This is an experience that we don't find very much acknowledged in terms of the sources. Hopefully we'll get to that. But I'm really gratified about to not be alone on this. We had a fight in H labor on this perhaps 30 years ago, in which I think I was the only one who was making the case for a great slave strike. And these are labor historians, but they seem to be making the case that if you don't have elected officers and you don't have membership cards and you don't have dues cards, how can you actually have a labor movement? Made me think about leaving the country. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you, Mark. For some reason, I'm getting a bit of an echo right now, but I'll try to persist through that. The great points, and let me just quickly say that, the initial point you made about how many of these large planters were also in manufacturing, investing in railroads, shareholders and on boards of directors of banks, and so on. Like, you're so right about this. When we talk about the integrated plantation, we often forget that, in fact, big planter capital in the South was, as you say, also integrated from agriculture to industry to banking and finance. And this shouldn't surprise us once as you say, we relax the categories and just think concretely and historically about them. And I love your point about the cities in which Black labor, often self-hiring. That's something I get into in great detail in the book, but I didn't today. That a percentage of hired out Black workers in the cities self-hired. They chose their employers, they bargained their own wages. And of course, as you say, they're interacting all the time with free Black people in the city, which makes the possibility of escape much greater, but it also means the development of a very robust political consciousness, whether it's Baltimore, you mentioned Louisville, Memphis, or even in poor old Texas, the role of Galveston, for instance, where the First International has a really dynamic branch right after the Civil War. So really great points. I thank you for that and for your work.
Okay, we're coming up on the 2-hour mark. I wonder if we can have a final lightning round with the last three people who are on stack. So keep your questions and comments brief, and David will try to do the same or not if you want to hang around a little longer. So let's go to George first.
Very quick and brief. Thank you for a great lecture, and Fred and MEP for a great presentation. My question, after Sean behind me and Jack, if you could address what you brought up about Barbados being known as an integrated plantation back in the 1640s. And I'm wondering how to situate your work with that of Nick Nesbitt and the Price of Smith. So that's my question. That's it, and thank you all.
Okay, yeah, Nick Nesbitt has been on my mind too as I read David's book. Sean Ahern, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for your book. I have it here, and I'm definitely going to give it a very close read. I really appreciated your critique of the misnomer that has clouded the vision of American Marxists for so many years in this country, that somehow the plantation systems, the plantations were not capitalist enterprises. And once we accept that, once we understand that, then it's clear that the chattel laborers were proletarians. And you go from there to, well, what's with American U.S. labor history that begins in the North with the artisans in the 1820s and 1830s? And the whole history of the resistance of the chattel laborers, the creation of the chattel labor system is beyond the pale of U.S. labor historians. And I think that Mark Laus was sort of referring to that. So this is a major contribution, in my opinion. And I actually first came across this stuff many years ago when I studied with Theodore W. Allen. I don't know if you're familiar with his work about the invention of the white race. And his focus is mainly on the development of chattel labor in North America. And he contrasts that with the forms of social control that emerged in the Caribbean versus the continental colonies. And so I just was wondering if you had any thought about the development of racial slavery as a particular component, sort of like the classic case in what developed in the colonial era in the continental colonies. And just again, thank you so much, because I think that for so long, American labor historians have been suffering from what I would call it the wage fetish. You know, they've looked at like, oh, well, they don't have a wage, so therefore they're not workers. It's sort of like what Mark was saying, they don't have a union card, so they're not workers. They're not, labor union. But so it's this wage fetish that has taken the place of an analysis of the social construct of exploited labor, whether you're chattel or quote unquote free, free to sell yourself piecemeal or bought and sold wholesale, But anyway, thank you again so much for your work, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. And also, I didn't know about Mark Laus. I'm looking forward to reading his work also. Thank you very much.
There's a great deal.
I'm going to agree with Sean's final comment and probably have some disagreements with what he was saying just before then. It was a great presentation. It was very interesting. I have only read the introduction to the book, and I'm really looking forward to reading the whole thing. But I admit to being one of the resistors to the notion that slaves were proletarians, because all of the things that you point to, the relations of value and also the autonomous culture that they had among themselves, but nevertheless, one of the hallmarks, or the hallmark possibly, of proletarian labor is that it's free and, can be, and it's free of ties to the land, which that quote freedom makes it necessary for them to enter the proletariat, but they can be dismissed at any time, they can leave at any time, and the very meaning of the word free obviously clashes with slavery. Now I'm going to read the book very soon, and maybe I'll be persuaded, but I do have that resistance to saying slaves could possibly be proletariat. And somewhat related, although not exactly, this is a genuine question, not a comment. Have you worked out, or has anybody worked out, the relations of production of surplus value that we find in Volume 1, and how would they apply to a chattel economy?
Go ahead, David.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for those comments. And I think what I'll do actually is there's a connection between George's question and Jack, the point that you were making at the end. So I'll come back. I'll conclude with Sean's comments and points, because George asks around the question of Nick Nesbitt's work, particularly I think probably his book, The Price of Slavery. And it relates very much to Jack's comment, because Nick Nesbitt also has the position that enslaved people were constant capital. And part of his argument there is something that Jack said, that apparently the belief that wage laborers can leave at any time. Now, the problem is that even when Marx was writing Capital when he published it in 1867, there were thousands of British workers who were prosecuted in courts every year for leaving their jobs. It was not taken in law at all that wage laborers had the right to leave whenever they wanted. In fact, the law said the opposite, that they could leave when all obligations had been fulfilled. And of course, the employer was the one who got to determine those obligations. Of course, sailors could not leave whenever they wanted. No indentured worker could leave whenever they wanted. And I think that Nick Nesbitt in The Price of Slavery accepts a smuggled in liberal notion of free wage labor and misses Marx's irony. Because when you read Volume 1 of Capital, Marx uses the term free, and then he says, in the double sense. And the key to the double sense, as he shows in Part 8, is that they have been dispossessed of all ties to the land. And then he starts to use a phraseology that's more ironic in German than when it's translated into English. He refers to them as free as a bird. Now, Marx knows that this means they have no rights, that birds have no rights in human society. Okay? And he starts to put the term free in quotes to say the so-called free laborer. Then he tells us, of course, women and children don't even have that nominal freedom in the labor market. And then he tells us that the worker belongs to capital. That's a direct quote from Volume 1, and is held by golden chains. In other words, I think what Marx is doing is demystifying the so-called freedom of the wage laborer. And I think that sometimes the liberal notion, and I think Nick Nesbitt falls for this too, very often workers do not have the right to leave when they choose, and particularly in Marx's day, they didn't. Let me come now to Sean's point. Yes, Sean, I do know and appreciate Ted Allen's work, The Invention of the White Race in particular. And what's interesting, I think, the work that I've done on the Caribbean allows me to see very similar processes. I mean, Ted Allen in The Invention of the White Race enormously emphasizes Bacon's Rebellion in the US case. When we go to Barbados, what we see is that even earlier, there are these joint uprisings of Irish indentured workers and Black bonded workers, and they're rebelling together. And so very similar to the processes that Allen describes in the US case, we start to see the planter class deliberately separating these Irish, it's not clear whether they're white, these Irish laborers who are indentured from Black, and they start to harden racial categories. Very, very similar process to what's happening in Virginia, say, after Bacon's Rebellion. And so, yeah, I think we need to be doing this work on, if you will, the class dynamics of racial formation and the way in which whiteness is forged as a system of social control and of labor control in just the way, Sean, that you were alluding to. My book touches on those issues definitely, but in that regard, it's also largely indebted to that kind of work. So let me just say that in closing what I said at the beginning, you've probably picked up why I said whoever writes about slavery writes about freedom. I think ultimately for all of the political economy of the book and the Marxist theory of the book, the deep dive into planter archives that I did, and so on, that this is a freedom story. And I hope it's read in those terms. And as always, big thanks to Fred. The Marxist Education Project does indispensable work, and I hope all of us will continue to support it, participate in its courses and its lectures, and so on, because we need this. So thank you, Fred. Thank you all.
And thank you, David. Thank you very much. This has been a really great, one of our probably top events over the past 5 years, both in terms of participation and the content. And we look forward to future opportunities. And always visit www.marxedproject.org. Join our reading group. It starts on Monday evening for an in-depth look at slavery and capitalism. And look forward to seeing all of you at future events. Thanks again, David. Thanks again, everyone.